I start to think back about the times when I used to be bored at work, and I feel almost nostalgic for those days. And then I think about these discussions that people have about quiet quitting, and I'm like, man, boredom, that was the best, because I like had time to do things and stuff. If I had time to be bored, then I had time to do other stuff too.
Or this sort of age of quitting has to do with the recognition on some level that a lot of our striving is not going to be rewarded.
It seems that one thing that boredom tells us, or one thing that boredom discloses, is obstructed agency. What boredom is making apparent is the fact that you don't have free choice in the situation that is boring you.
My most boring job was at Dick's Sporting Goods, mostly because all of the televisions were on and none of them were playing anything I wanted to watch.
Hello and welcome to Boredom Matters, the ISBS podcast with me, Annie Runkle. This is our second episode and hopefully the beginning of a much more regular publication schedule, so do watch out for further episodes soon. Today, I am joined by my colleague Busra, who talked to three experts about the topic of boredom and work, and I'm going to hand over to her right away.
I'm Busra, and I'm a PhD candidate in comparative literature at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. And today I'm going to be your host. And we have three guests. Now I will turn it over to them.
My name's Charlie Tyson. I'm a PhD student in English literature at Harvard, where I'm writing a dissertation on how idleness is depicted in modern literature from late 19th century to the present.
My name is Yonina Hoffman. I'm an assistant professor at the United States Merchant Marine Academy. And I have worked a little bit on boredom with David Foster Wallace, and am interested in the philosophical side of things as well.
And I am Sheila Liming, and I'm associate professor at Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont. And I write and work on American literature from the late 1800s to present, effectively, especially focusing on Edith Wharton, but on all sorts of other topics and things that fall in that time frame too.
Yonina is working on boredom. Charlie is working on idleness, a related state, and Sheila has a book entitled Hanging Out, which examines the various ways in which we hang out in groups, online, at parties, and at work. I also wanted to include voices who are not necessarily working on boredom, but are working on idleness or hanging out or killing time or doing nothing. What attracted you to boredom or to the topic today, or in general, what is your interest in boredom?
I was sort of drawn professionally to boredom by David Foster Wallace because I did my dissertation on his novels. But I think there's also for me a deep interest in existentialism, which I studied in college, and in the way that boredom seems to tune us into the certain formations that existential problems, I don't know, the way that those problems present us today. And of course, then that brings us to this question of work and the way that sort of modernity or post-modernity or whatever we're in right now has a particular shape of boredom.
I'll just follow up there on what Yonina said. Just to echo that I also come at the subject of boredom, I think, through the lens of work. And I'm interested in the relationship of boredom or of any kind of inaction to the kind of action that we take for granted in a productive capacity when we label it work. And especially to why so much of what we do in order to be, stereotypically successful as laborers has to do with activities that are really branded as idleness and inaction. And that has to do with forming social ties. That has to do, as I'm sure any scholar can understand, with reading, which is usually something that's not seen as valued in the work that we produce. So any kind of activity that's viewed as idleness or boredom in contradistinction to productive work.
I share the interest in work that Sheila and Yonina have mentioned. And in my research on idleness, one thing I found in critical accounts of idleness that disparage idleness as empty or lacking in value, they'll often identify a strain of boredom within idleness. So just to give a recent example of a conservative op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It was a very classic, conservative op-ed about how the American people are losing their work ethic. This is going to put us behind. But the description of idleness given in the op-ed was of people wallowing in their homes, watching television for 12 hours a day, but not enjoying what they're watching, not seeing anyone. So this specter of not idleness as some writers have understood it, as a domain of freely chosen activity that we pursue for its own sake, or a domain of kind of pleasurable inactivity where we might engage in contemplation or aesthetic experience, but instead as boredom. So I figured I would need to disaggregate boredom and idleness. Clearly they converge, but idleness has this double valent sense where it can be very positive, but also, of course, associated with melancholy, degeneration, inaction, and a kind of stuckness. Whereas boredom, I think, is seen as even more negative. But Yonina and I were in this cluster that Busra, you edited on boredom, and we both found within boredom some more positive elements. So we might go into those later.
This Portuguese author, Fernando Pessoa, in his book, The Book of Disquiet, has this passage that I love. It's not that long, but I'll just select a few sentences. He uses the word tedium rather than boredom. So he says, it is said that tedium is a disease of the idle, or that it attacks only those who have nothing to do. But this ailment of the soul is in fact more subtle. It attacks people who are predisposed to it, and those who work or who pretend they work are less apt to be spared than the truly idle. Tedium is not the disease of being bored because there's nothing to do, but the more serious disease of feeling that there's nothing worth doing. This means that the more there's to do, the more tedium one will feel. I'd better off remaining idle, doing nothing and having nothing to do, because that tedium, though real enough, I could at least enjoy. So is it something we can enjoy, you think? Or is that where boredom becomes enjoyable idleness?
By the way, I love that quotation you selected from Pessoa. I love the whole book of Disquiet. Everything in that book is just so sumptuously quotable. That's part of what I love about that book, is that it tries to document tedium and it tries to document boredom. And one thing that it does show us is that boredom can be, I guess, enjoyable, but that's not even the point, to think of it that way. For Pessoa, it's this like kind of interstitial place. Boredom is gestational. It's this moment between tedium, doing things that you get no enjoyment from, but have to do over and over again anyway, and this moment between something else that feels more desirable or more productive or more useful. And I think, with regards to the creative process, that's something that we tend to undervalue, that we don't just go from productive task to productive task without any kind of stops or gaps or anything like that, but that we do need these kind of spaces in between things to gather ourselves and to kind of exist. And, I would say, I guess, dialectically in this kind of synthesis or point in between, right? Between production and idleness. And I think boredom can be that sometimes.
I love the point about boredom as gestational. There's a long tradition of associating boredom with creativity. So I wrote about Ibsen's play Hedda Gabler, and this play gives us an example of how boredom might be associated not just with creativity, but also with destruction, a different way of asserting your presence in the world. And what happens with Hedda is her boredom is really a kind of existential boredom, where she sees the surroundings in which she's trapped as just so paltry, lacking in possibility for her. This is kind of boredom as a posture of superiority, which I think is one way in which boredom can be enjoyable. If you reflect on your boredom as, there really is more to life than this, and my boredom is an index of that. Still, being bored might not be so fun, but it might be revelatory in that way. But with Hedda, she ends up destroying not only her own life, but the life of her husband, her former lover, pretty much everyone around her. In the psychological literature, the link between boredom and aggression is very nicely documented. So this is, another product of boredom that I think is interesting, where it's gestational and that it can lead us to creative tasks and projects, as Sheila has said, but it also might lead to these kinds of acts of revolt or uprising, whether on a very small scale, as is the case with Hedda Gabler, or perhaps larger scale as well.
That's like part of how it fits into the way that I think about boredom at work. Boredom is this kind of this feeling that happens when you're a little bit trapped, and you're not able to act purposefully in a way that feels meaningful to you. I've been reviewing my Heidegger because I've been thinking about how boredom connects to care. And one of the passages that I was just looking at today feels like very much a picture of boredom at work. Heidegger calls it a tranquilized willing under the guidance of the they. Basically, when my own will is sort of stymied or channeled by the powers that be around me. And so what it means to actually exert myself as a person has this tranquilized character that ultimately then, I mean, if you're doing something that's not completely tranquilizing, you can kind of have this double vision where you start to see how tranquilized you are. And then I think that frustration and that violence and that rage can come to the fore.
I'll confess to not knowing much about Heidegger, but what I can say is that it seems that one thing that boredom tells us, or one thing that boredom discloses, is obstructed agency. And sure, we can be bored for other reasons. Maybe it's an attitude problem. For example, if you're watching, like some long movie and you're dozing off, well, maybe it's a quality of your attention, but very often, certainly in the bored housewives cases that I wrote about, but I think also in the bored office workers cases that you wrote about, Yonina, what boredom is making apparent is the fact that you don't have free choice in the situation that is boring you.
This made me think of, I was just reading Yonina's essay for the cluster. And Yonina, you were mentioning a book that I had read as well, which is Hallie Butler's The New Me, which is, effectively about a girl who can't secure permanent employment, right? She goes from temporary job to temporary job. And each of the jobs is effectively boring to her because she knows that there's no end point that is going to sort of pay off for her. So no matter the content of the job itself, and it doesn't matter what she's doing, if she's working in an office or an agency or an art gallery or whatever, the content ends up being stifling in the same way, because she knows that her actions there don't lead anywhere productive in a way that matters to her too. So I would argue that book is about boredom and tedium at the same time, but also about exactly those Heideggerian structures of power that you were just talking about, Yonina.
So this all made me think about when Charlie said acts of revolt, how boredom could lead to acts of revolt, and all the discussion that we just had about workplace and so on. Then what about quitting? So what kind of, there is quitting or refusing work or resignation. So this is integral to work, but it's not a decision that one can exercise easily because there's a financial aspect. Not everyone can afford to leave work or refuse work. So that also comes, I would say, with you need to have some sort of security or maybe privilege to be able to refuse work. But then again, we're in this quiet quitting age. And so what do you think about quitting and boredom, or refusing work because of being bored?
Well, I think it connects rather nicely to that Pessoa quote that you read earlier, when he said, "The tedium of those who strive hard is the worst of all." Because I started to think about what striving looks like in our age. And I think that maybe part of this sort of age of quitting has to do with the recognition on some level that a lot of our striving is not going to be rewarded. And then the pain of that recognition is intense, right? Because you've perhaps already sort of sold out in a sense to some other task that has nothing to do with what you care about, and you're striving in a sense that if you put in at least this commitment to the system, it will give you something back. And then to realize then doubly you've lost not only your own will, but you've lost the repayment that you thought you would get for giving your will away. That pain might be part of why quitting is reaching this surprising apex, despite the material forces that might make it rather dangerous.
The pain that Yonina talks about with regard to paying into a system that doesn't reward you for it or doesn't give much back is intensified because of changes in the nature of work especially since 1970s, but arguably going back further, to a greater emphasis on the effective emotional side of work, a service economy where it's not just about being in an assembly line or creating an object, but it's about selling our personalities and sensibilities and subjectivities. And if we are investing in reshaping our inner lives in accordance to the dictates of what we think the job market wants, and then we find that we don't get much for it, then we don't have a sort of stable backup self to, fall back on. So this is a very dangerous thing.
When we read studies of burnout, and I'm thinking particularly of Sarah Jaffe's book, Work Will Never Love You Back, that came out 2 years ago. When we read these discussions of burnout, I think what we are generally reading about is exposure to too much action and too much stimulation, and the requirement that one respond to that stimulation in prescripted ways within a workplace. That can be emotionally exhausting and mentally draining, and in the end, ultimately tedious. If your job is just to put out fires all day long, as so many jobs it feels like these days are, then that act itself, no matter how big the fire, becomes itself quite tedious in the end. And I don't know about you guys, but these days, I start to think back about the times when I used to be bored at work, and I feel almost nostalgic for those days. And then I think about these discussions that people have about quiet quitting, and I'm like, man, boredom, that was the best, because I had time to do things and stuff. If I had time to be bored, then I had time to do other stuff too. Now I find that I rarely do. So it's a different kind of situation that I find myself working in. And I don't know if that's true for anyone else, but
Well, I like the distinction that you made here between tedium and boredom, because it also sounds as if what you're talking about with tedium here is a kind of a social tedium. And I'm interested in the kind of the push and pull in this conversation about boredom or tedium between the individual and the social. And I wanted to ask, I was looking at your book, which looks really exciting, about the sociality, the way that sociality plays into the way that we assess boredom. Because okay, well, here you were talking about the way that we become kind of fatigued with this social mandate to respond in certain ways, to sort of play all of the bureaucratic games that are given to us. But on the other hand, at least in the descriptions about your book, it seemed like sociality might have been also a kind of the potential for how to reclaim empty time. It seems, hanging out with others is the baseline. I don't know, would you speak to that at all? Is there solitude in your book, or is it mostly about being with others?
Hanging out is committing to not doing very much and not doing it in the presence of others, which is in some ways a radical thing, because I feel like so many of our social interactions are supposed to be arranged around certain kind of programmatic tasks or accomplishments or things that are supposed to be achieved within the context of that hanging out or that interaction. And I'm interested thinking about what it means to exist socially without that kind of a agenda, without trying to make something come about as the result, and what kinds of different relationships end up getting formed, which can sometimes lead to other, maybe even more radical agendas further down the line. So yeah, the sociality, that question is really important for me. But it all starts with time. And that means that time has to be seized. It has to be wrested away from other things where it would otherwise be devoted or spent or wasted, etc. I'm very interested in the metaphors that we have for time, right? About spending them, wasting them, killing them, things like that, as though any kind of excess time that's left over automatically is a bad thing and points to some kind of fault on the part of the individual.
It doesn't matter how much free time you have if you spend your time and your life basically doing something you don't love, which is your work. And there are more representations of unhappy workers than happy workers, it seems, in literary depictions at least. And all that reminds me this. I saw a street interview. So they were interviewing people in Vancouver. They stopped someone, and that person happened to be a software engineer working for Facebook. And so they asked him about his job, and he went on and on and on. Basically, what it all comes down to is you are sitting in front of a computer for 12, 13 or 14 or 16 hours a day. And then the interviewer asked, so how much do you make a year? And he said $200,000, But the way, like his tone, the way he talks about it, it's very monotonous. You can't tell if he's bored, if he likes his job. And the interviewer said, "Oh, what do you do in your free time?" And then he said, "Well, you don't have much free time, and you should be willing to give up your social life." So I can't tell if this person is happy, because I mean, I don't know if he is okay with this because he makes a lot of money. So what matters nowadays? Like, what are we willing to give up, or what are the values of people nowadays, do you think? Why people do what they do?
Well, it sounds as if he's sort of been happy becoming robotic in a sense. I mean, not having seen the interview. Which, I mean, on one hand amuses me because I recently have been reading about like AI conversations and the question of sentience. And at the same time that we want our people to become more robotic, we want our robots to become more like people, which is weird. But it seems almost as if that sort of internal force that we all have been touching on, the thing that comes out when boredom is there, whether that's in my essay, a kind of radical potential following Wallace, or in Charlie's essay, if that's a radical possibility of violence. It sounds like that force underneath it all is not there for this guy. The sort of the unruly, or the that which has not been co-opted by the system of labor. So I guess it sounds a little unnerving to me, but it's probably fairly normal to a certain extent in the tech community. And maybe we have to start thinking about like the affective structures that are rewarded in our world and how somebody like that comes to be.
We've known for a long time that labor specialization, adapting ourselves to the needs of the economic activity we're pursuing, that kind of self-alteration can be narrowing and destructive. This is how Adam Smith starts The Wealth of Nations, by talking about the division of labor in a pin factory and how we might become much more efficient by producing many more pens. But he worries that this could be very stultifying for the workers involved. There's a whole tradition of thinking about how work can narrow us, deform us, and who knows what this fellow in tech is really like, but it seems like he's internalized everything that his company has wanted him to internalize. And one thing we might take from this, from the point of view of, assessing the kind of quality of labor, is that it sounds like a very materially lucrative position if he's getting paid $200,000. So on paper, it looks great. But I think that we might need to develop a stronger vocabulary for how to talk about these psychological or spiritual goods that are being shoved off the table by the demands of the workplace.
I agree with you, Charlie, in thinking about like what would be the appropriate vocabulary, even just a more enhanced vocabulary to try to capture some of these feelings here. And following off of Yonina, what was saying, why we would greet a kind of roboticized lifestyle as being itself virtuous or good, or something that we're even willing to suffer and put up with, especially if it's for the sake of money that we would then have less time to even enjoy or spend. So I think of Adorno here. Obviously, his classic essay on free time reminds us that the vast majority of quote unquote free time, or leisure time, as he calls it, is actually related to or devoted to work preparation activities. That a lot of the time that we spend when we're not working is doing things that are going to make us more fit for work when we have to enter back into it, whether that is feeding and nourishing our bodies, whether that is exercising, whether it is cleaning things, like laundering clothing, whatever it happens to be, so that the next time work comes around, we're more fit and able to get back into that scenario. Which suggests that Adorno's saying that it's kind of like that already, and he's writing in the 1940s, but it's kind of like that already, whether or not we're actually fessing up to the fact that we're working all the time. That, even engaging in those work preparation activities, we're basically doing something similar to what the interviewee that Busra describes was talking about, working that much. And I'm interested, in that story, Busra, as an anecdote of like thinking about where the time goes and when work stops, if it ever stops, and when you can say that something is over, a work task or a time period in which you're expected to be productive and maybe idleness or boredom can take over. And I'm thinking of this Atlantic article that was published last spring that was talking about the third peak, productivity peak in the workday now. So like sociologists used to observe that there were two kind of working peaks in the day. One was sort of early in the morning, like 9, 10 a.m. for people after they show up to work and settle into a task. The second one was a few hours after lunch where they kind of like get more activity back and kind of like, pick up and then coast into the end of the day. And then they were noticing, according to keyboard strokes that had been logged by Microsoft employees, they were noticing the return of a third peak between 7 and 9 p.m. So after dinner. Basically, the people were going home, eating dinner, and then going back to work again, but at home. Or if they were remote working, then they were just doing this continuously throughout the day, working in 3 shifts and interspersing it with meals to break up the shifts. And if that's the case, then it's not surprising to think about how work mushrooms into a 12, 13, 14, 16-hour day. And you have been staring at your computer for that long and maybe didn't even realize that that much work was happening during that time period.
With that, I also wanted to open a discussion around laziness and the perception of laziness, because we are more used to hearing or saying idle and bored, but it almost always comes with idle, rich, and bored. And if we go back to the literary depictions of bored figures, basically rich or bourgeois, like easily irritated gentlemen. So, but when it comes to working class or workers, when you see them, and Charles Dickens's Hard Times, I think, does a good job presenting this cross-class condition of boredom and class prejudicial takes. If a working class individual is seen as being idle, then, it's laziness. And whereas, if basically you're rich, then it's basically your right to be idle and bored, or it comes with the territory. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on laziness and maybe idleness too. I don't know, maybe Charlie has more to say about this.
One quick thing I should say to answer your question about boredom among working class figures or workers is one point that George Orwell emphasizes in his book Down and Out in Paris and London is how boring it is to be in total poverty, where in the spells where he's out of work and has no money, he's essentially just lying in bed, hoping that, someone will give him a crust of bread. He doesn't have the energy to do anything. He doesn't have the money to even engage in acts of consumption. So boredom is certainly a burden sure, there are plenty of bored rich people for a number of reasons, but at least they have their trinkets to play with. Probably the most punishing effects of boredom are at the bottom of the income pyramid. And there's a lot to say about, idleness or laziness as an insult projected onto vulnerable groups in society, whether people who are working class, racial minorities, women, but it's such a large topic that I'm not sure the best way to steer into it.
Among the upper classes and among the bourgeois, laziness or the right to claim laziness is a sign that something has been done right? That you have won extra time, that you have succeeded, that you have the right to be lazy because you have done certain things correctly. And among the working classes and among the poor, it's a sign that something has gone wrong. It's a sign that you are unemployed, you're out of work, that you are messing up in one way or another and failing to fulfill part of the social contract about your own personal productivity. So it does come with a stain for the working classes that, of course, it doesn't necessarily come with for the upper classes. And I think it's important to think about the way that they appear split there in our discussions of them. And of course, we have different words and vocabulary for thinking about them at different levels of the class spectrum too. I think there's a fear of laziness that comes from the top down within the hierarchical class pyramid, that upper classes and people in positions of power fear laziness, perhaps because they're the most acquainted with it. And they fear that everyone below them is being overly lazy and create these kind of mechanisms for trying to, shame us into thinking about our work productivity, or else trying to monitor us, and surveil our work productivity. It made me think about an employer that I don't work for anymore, but an institution I used to work for that made us go through manual training every year on what they called time theft. And these were tests we had to take to figure out when we were stealing time from the company, meaning the university I worked for. And we had to do this every year. And I thought it was fascinating because what they were really quizzing us on is like, are you being lazy? Could you use your time better? And in being lazy, are you perhaps threatening our bottom line as the institution that pays your salary?
Wow, that is absolutely insane. Also connecting to the keystroke study that you were talking about earlier, are they paying attention to the fact that there are so many keystrokes being done in the evening, and the fact that our time is being stolen from us?
It's truly bonkers about time theft. And it seems like all these methods of accounting for productivity are open to questioning. What if, for example, I worked at your former university and I had 2 or 3 weeks of a fallow period where it seemed like I was doing nothing, but then I turned around and wrote a great article or designed a great class. Wouldn't that be, I mean, I would think that would be better in the end, both for me and for the institution. But it seems like the trend lines, certainly in industry and probably in academia as well, are for these kind of banal methods of surveillance, accounting, just to make sure you're plodding along. And this seems to me bad for creativity, bad for innovation, and obviously morally bad. But if we're just arguing on the basis of a bottom line, it's not clear that an institution should want to do this. I think they're misguided in their ideas about what counts as productive activity.
I was wondering, what was the most boring job you've ever had?
When I used to work retail jobs, like back when I was in college and stuff like that, often a lot of hours of the day where you didn't see very much action in the store that you were working in, but there was this kind of mandate to be open during those hours and available for the customers in order to create this image that, of course, you're always available, right? And so people can come in if you want to. So I always found the first several hours of the day when I worked in retail stores would often be, time when you saw absolutely no action. And depending on what was happening and what store I was working in, I could get some reading done, during that time back in the day.
I worked as a sandwich artist at Subway for about 5 years in high school and college. And the job was enlivened only by the horrific revelations that it yielded about what was actually going on behind the scenes at the sandwich shop. The pattern that Sheila describes with retail was very much the case at Subway, where there are spells of boredom and emergency. But I mean, you're just making sandwiches, so it shouldn't be this high stakes. But for some people, this is their life. They take it really seriously. So you're waiting around. It's 11 a.m. People aren't at lunch yet, or it might be 3 p.m. You let the odd customer, and you have to just be in a state of expectant readiness. You can't, gallivant, read a book. You're wearing the gloves to prepare the sandwiches. You're ready to go as soon as someone walks in the door. So there was a little bit of hanging out with the few coworkers who I liked and others who I was afraid of. But I thought that was pretty boring. And the lack of autonomy was a big part of the boredom.
I worked in retail a little, and I remember folding shirts and just doing maintenance. I think it was just mind numbing, and I hated it. That's why I barely fold my laundry. I hate it.
I was going to say part of what made retail jobs such hell too, and so boring, was that our soundtrack in the stores that I worked in would be on a loop. And it'd be on a loop of usually about 2 hours long. So you would know when, how much time was passing by all the songs that would come back around again. And it was always just the same loop. So I heard it day in and day out. And it was like a very vulgar reminder of how slowly time was passing when each new song came along.
I'll just add that I guess my most boring job was at Dick's Sporting Goods for so many reasons, but mostly because all of the televisions were on and none of them were playing anything I wanted to watch.
That's a nice summary statement for modernity.
This was Yonina Hoffman, Charlie, Tyson and Sheila Liming on the topic of boredom and work. In this episode, we considered boredom through the lens of work and the conditions under which we work. We also looked at the relationship between boredom and work through the lens of idleness and free time, and how the expenditure of time takes shape today. And we discussed the need to develop a new, more appropriate vocabulary for how to talk about the psychological impacts of the demands of the workplace. Sheila's new book, Hanging Out: The Radical Power of Killing Time, which was referenced in this episode, is out now, available for order. Yonina, Charlie, and I collaborated on an essay cluster project entitled Bored as Hell for the contemporary section of the online journal Post 45. You can find the essays referenced in this episode at post45.org under the Contemporaries tab. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you very much once again to all our guests.